Hello and welcome to the lecture podcast that replaces the podcast for lectures 3 and 4 of EC 4004 Economics for Business. So we stopped at the end of lecture 2 on the canonical description of the households. The idea here, and you would have seen this in your basic micro course, is that the household will maximize its consumption of two goods, which we'll call X1 and X2. But I mean, these things could be, something like guns and butter. They could be pizza and beer, whatever you like. The idea here is that at any particular point in time, let's say X, there's a certain amount of utility to be gained from consuming a certain amount of X2 and a certain amount of X1. And the simple fact of the matter is, because we've assumed a monotonicity, which means people perform more or less, and people are maximizing their utility, you will never choose this point here, you will never choose this point here, you'll never choose this point here, but you may choose this point here upon your budget constraint, which is a straight line given by this equation, which says the price of good 1 times the quantity of good 1 plus the price of good 2 times the quantity of good 2 has to be less than or equal to some amount M, where M can be something like, 100 euros a week or something like that. And the question then becomes, okay, where on this line do you go? Well, if we assume that people prefer more or less, and if we also assume that people prefer goods in reasonably mixed quantities, the goods are normal. In other words, if your income increases, you'd like more of it. Then the idea here is that you're going to be somewhere on this line, and more than likely you're going to be in the middle. But exactly where you are depends on the curvature of this red line. This red line is called an indifference curve. And the basic idea of the indifference curve is that it in some sense represents the utility you get from a consumption of this particular bundle of goods. So where these two lines are tangent, we'll call this point A. This is the point at which you have maximized your utility subject to this budget constraint. Now, the particular functional form that I've used is x to the power of 0.5 times x2 to the power of 0.5, which means you like 50-50 combinations of the two goods. So on average, you're always going to be roughly in the middle here. And some people have asked questions about what's the difference between this part of the function and this. Well, this part says that utility comes from X1 and X2. And this part here, the explicit part, says this is the combination. This is the exact proposal that's there. And the way you get out here is by something called constraint optimization. And you can check out the podcast on constraint optimization, which is linked to on the blog. But just as I said at the end of the last lecture, this is just one way to describe households. We have at all times to deal with the shadow of the future. At the end of the day, you can choose to mediate the value of the future to the present using the discount rate. The idea of the discount rate is it in some sense gives you a way to measure the fact that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Okay, the idea that you should at all times take the future with a grain of salt, basically. Okay, how many metaphors can one man mix? Okay, let's just take an example. Here you are at time t, and here you are at time t plus k. So let's say this is 2012, and this here is 2020. Okay, so you have 100 euros today. The question that you're asked is 100 euros today. What is that 100 euros going to be worth to you in 8 years, right? Where k here is obviously 8. So that's a big question. I mean, personally, I would quite happily defer the 100 euros, but I'm not going to accept 100 euros. I probably want something like 120 or 130. Okay. Yep. And that's just a fact, right? I would prefer to use the 100 euros now than have the chance to get it back in a couple of years' time. Okay. So you might think this is a bit abstract, but the truth about it is the insurance companies have to deal with this all the time. One particular concrete question is, if you have to save the life of somebody, if it's worth spending €1 million today, how much would you spend to save the same life in 20 years? And if that sounds like a harsh question, it is harsh. And if it sounds cruel, it is cruel. But you do have to have an answer if you're an insurance company. And it turns out the answer, by the way, is about 150,000. Okay? So we have this discounting. The idea here is that we in some sense discount the future. So the idea here is that a euro today is worth more than a euro at some time in the future. So this would be a euro at time t is clearly worth more than a euro at time t plus k. Okay, this is the same time value principle that underlies the concept of interest, and therefore you're going to have some kind of reverse compounding. Yeah, some kind of reverse compounding in the system. Okay, so for example, suppose some lender, we'll call him Larry, loans some borrower, we'll call him Barry, 100 euros in year 1 to be repaid in year 2. Larry's going to forego the current use of the 100 euros only if Barry pays her, this is a woman called Larry for some reason, pays her a premium for that foregone use when Barry repays the loan a year or 2. So that premium is clearly interest. Okay, and if Barry and Larry agree that Barry's going to pay 110 in year 2 for the use of Larry's 100 euros in year 1, the simple interest rate is obviously 10%. Now, if we asked Larry how much 110 in year 2 is worth, at the end of the day, this lady called Larry, will probably answer 100. Okay, L in that sense discounts Larry discounts the money she's going to receive in the future by roughly 10%. And there's a really good discussion of this at this link. It's really, really interesting, and it's where the little example there came from. So the idea that we left on in the last class was, right, you have 2 periods, young and old. You have to allocate your consumption between young and old. So you've got some amount of consumption C1 and some amount of consumption C2. Well, how are you going to, so this is consumption in period 1, consumption in period 2. How are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? So when you're young, this is period 1. When you're old, this is period 2. And then you die. Well, you should mediate. When you're young, you've got to figure this out. You should mediate it by the discount rate. 1 plus R. Okay? 1 plus R. And R will determine the curvature of this line. Okay? So for example, it might look like this. Okay? Or something like that. Yeah. The shape would be some kind of curved form, which should remind you of what we've just discussed a minute ago. Well, now, at the end of the day, if people don't make choices based on an environment of full information, the truth about it is most of the time we don't have a clue what's going to happen in the future, or we've got some probability distribution around which certain things might happen. You all know that you're going to die, but what you're going to die from, you don't specifically know. You know there's a 30-40% chance it's going to be cancer, 30-40% chance it's going to be some heart-related problem, and probably 20% for everything else. Okay, but you don't know where that's going to be. Your attitude to risk will define many of your choices. So we can define 3 classes, roughly speaking, following Kenneth Arrow and Maurice Allais and others who have thought long and hard about this, as 3 types. So risk neutral means you will accept a fair bet. A fair bet being something like a 50-50 split. So you've got a 50-50 chance of winning or losing a car. So here, if you win, you get a car, but if you lose, you give me your car. Okay? If you're risk neutral, you're going to take that bet. If you risk loving, if this is now winning is a 40% chance, losing 60% chance, you're going to take the bet. And if you're risk averse, you won't take that fair bet. Most people, most of the time, are very risk averse. So, a lottery. There's 2 lotteries in the system. Lottery 1 promises a sure win of 30 euros. Brand new sure win of 30 euros. Lottery L2 gives you 80% of the chance to win 45 and 0 in 20% of the cases. So your expected utility from the first one is clearly, you've got probability 1 times 30 euros. So you get 30. Your expected utility from the second, from lottery 1 here, lottery 2 here, your expected utility is going to be 0.8, 80% chance multiplied by 45 plus 0.2, 20% chance of 0. Okay, 20% chance of 0. So 0.8 times 4.5 plus 0.2 times 0. The truth about it is, even though L1 is less than L2, the expected value is clearly, like 0.8 times 4.5 is clearly bigger than 30. At the end of the day, most people choose L2, and I think that's really interesting. I've always been really interested in that fact that most people will choose that value. They won't take the bet, even though it is clearly better for them. Okay, it's clearly better for them that you're going to win 36 instead of 30. So at the end of the day, people choose this. They choose L1. Let's take another case. Lottery K1 promises 25% chance of winning 30. So the expected utility is just either 0.25 times 30 plus plus 0.75 times nothing. Okay, or K2, I'll put it down here. K2 is just expected utility of 20% chance 0.2 times 4.5. Okay, in this case, it's pretty obvious what the payoff is. It's going to be pretty symmetrical in both cases. Okay, so in this case, what you see for lottery B versus lottery A is a disjuncture. People aren't logical. They're not consistent between their choices of A and B. So for A, typically, this is called the Allais paradox after Maurice Allais, who won the Nobel Prize for this work. Also a dedicated physicist, by the way. So this is Maurice Allais. For A, typically L1 is strictly preferred to L2. For B, the typical choice is K2 over K1, although they differ only in that in each lottery 3/4 of the original probability of a positive amount are cancelled. This is the Allais paradox, which is it shows that people generally don't behave rationally. There's not a rational. Don't behave rationally. And in class we talked about this investor game idea. So imagine this is more or less where we came from. Here's our utility function, and the idea here is that the expected utility, which is sort of like, think of this expectation as a long run average, is just the probability of outcome 1 times the utility from outcome 1 plus the probability of outcome 2 times the utility of outcome 2. So, for example, if we take a look at this example, there is an agent with some wealth, W, of let's say 20 euros, and they're presented with a choice, which is a gamble. Win 10 euros with a probability of 50% or lose 10 euros with a probability of 50%. In other words, this is a fair bet. The expected value, which is E of W, of this is 0.5 times 20 plus 10. So the initial wealth plus what you might win, plus 0.5 times 20 minus 10, the initial wealth minus what you might lose. So it's 20. You stand to recover the same amount. This is a fair bet. So the expected utility of this wealth is just P1 times UW1 plus P2 times UW2. So it's 0.5 times U, 20 plus 10 plus 0.5 times U, 20 minus 10, and that gives you the amount. If the expected value of UW, which is up here, okay, UW, is it less than the utility of the expected value, then the person is risk averse. So the expected utility of wealth is less than the utility of the expected wealth. You say the person is going to be risk averse, and that's how you test for that. And that's something that I'd expect that you'd be able to do in the exam, definitely. So this is lots of examples. The best known examples are in insurance, and the idea here is that you have a certain problem in insurance, which is that there's a probability of some outcome A, okay, where A might be Stephen breaking his leg, right? And you have to insure that person. And if I'm a normal person, then there's a probability that I'm going to break my leg today or not. But if I'm somebody who's completely accident prone all the time, and I know that, then what I'm going to do effectively is push my issues onto somebody else, because I'm going to be claiming a lot more. So insurance is really about figuring that out. The probability of person A1 hurting themselves and the probabilities of person A2. Let's say this is somebody really accident prone. Yeah, and they know they're accident prone. Okay. So there are two problems. One is moral hazard, that's behaving differently because you know you're insured, and there's adverse selection. This is where you end up pushing good insurable people out of the market simply because there are so many bad, less than insurable people in the market. So that pushes up the premia, and you end up with only risky people in the market. This notion of expected utility also has applications to game theory and strategic defense. You know, what happens if you do something and then if I do something. Now these are all useful models. The model of decision making under certainty and decision making under uncertainty. They're very useful because you can do a couple of things. You can do what's called comparative statics, which is the idea that you shift one value of one variable and watch the model change. You've seen a lot of that last year and this year. And the idea is, you know, you've got supply and demand or something like that. You change the price level and watch it shift out. Okay, that's comparative statics. You've been doing that quite a bit. Welfare analysis, you can see who is better off. Let's say if people are forced to save, if the quality of goods change, and so on and so forth. And finally, policy analysis. You can see how behavior changes if risk attitudes change. What happens when you change insurance premia? What happens when you change the interest rate on debt, and so on and so forth. They're very, very useful because you can do these things. So the fact that they're unrealistic doesn't stop them from being useful ways of thinking about the world. Now, there are many elements of rational decision making. Individuals normally make choices to maximize some objective function, that is your utility from consumption, utility from leisure, utility from being young, and so on and so forth. Under the constraints you face, you have to maximize utility subject to your budget. You can only consume a certain amount. And if you want to borrow, then effectively what you're doing is you're stealing from the future. But your utility function must be pretty stable. In an uncertain world, then what you do is you're going to assign probabilities, right? You're going to assign probabilities based on what you've seen before. That's the idea, that there's some outcome, and you're going to play those probabilities. But probabilities imply that you've got some risk model. Yeah, you've got some model of the world that says, well, okay, I'm getting married to somebody, and 50% of the time the marriages work out. So maybe the worst marriages are down here somewhere in the distribution, and here are most people's. This is a pretty useless marriage. This is an amazing marriage, and this is sort of best marriage ever, kind of thing. You think you're there. That's the idea, that you're going to compare the opportunity cost, let's say, of being single to the opportunity cost of having a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a husband or a wife or a partner, whatever. Okay, that implies that you're going to do that, and you're going to pursue these activities until your marginal benefit of having a wife equals the marginal cost of having a wife, right? And so that's kind of important. That's the rational view of the economic actor. You assume the sunk costs are sunk. This idea that if you put 20 years into a marriage, that's effectively meaningless. What matters is the next 20 years, or the next year, in fact. We also assume that you have consistent behavior across time, choices, markets. So you're going to behave the same when you're 21 as when you're 71. Same idea. And you're going to behave the same depending on what choices you have. You'll always assume that more choice is better. While these are highly unrealistic assumptions, and in fact a lot of behavioral economics and experimental economics, psychological research and statistics has shown that a lot of the stuff is inconsistent in reality, it's still a useful model, because at the end of the day, we can rely on choices to infer preferences. This does work. We can rely on choices to infer preferences. And this is the notion of ideal preference. I don't know what you think about Mars bars. You might hate them. You might love them. You might think they're the greatest thing of all time. You might, if a Mars bar was your bed, you might want to sleep on the floor. I don't know. What I do know is, once you buy that Mars bar, I can assume that you prefer that to any other choice at that moment, given your utility function, which is not observed. So this is quite a different theory from the Keynesian theory of consumption, which is the idea that when disposable income rises, households spend more. So the idea here is that much like the neoclassical consumption theory, this is also a psychological theory. It's a theory of how people might behave. Yeah, it's a theory of how people might behave. It's a psychological theory. It's based on observation. And we're not looking at one individual, right? We're looking at some group of people called households, big H households. What we say is formally the household's marginal propensity to consume increases if its income increases, which says NPC is equal to delta C times divided by delta Y. So how will your consumption go up if your income goes up? So let's look at this simple consumption function here, which is a straight line. It says your disposable income here, if I increase it somehow by either decreasing your taxes or increasing your income, and this value is, if I increase it by 100 euros, and the value of your marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, okay, and this value is 100, then clearly consumption in this particular period is going to be 180, okay, and that's what this is telling you. Okay, this is related to another theory called the permanent income hypothesis, which is that you actually think about your consumption function at a particular point in time, based on your disposable income at a particular point in time. And actually what you do is you think about ways to smooth your income when you're young and when you're old. You actually think about ways to stop this from happening, where you end up with all of your consumption when you're young and then you're very, very poor when you're old. You don't want that. You don't want that at all. You don't want a really horrible life when you're older. What you'd like to do is you'd like to smooth that consumption out like that. Maybe you'd like most of the consumption in your youth, but you'd also like some of it in the future. Okay. So what's been happening to consumption in Ireland? Well, frankly speaking, it's been falling through the floor. This is consumption from 1997 to 2011, and you can see that if the boom had have continued, that we would have ended up kind of here. But actually we didn't. And the difference between the two is a massive gap in thinking about what's happening to the rest of the economy. So consumption has fallen through the floor. I think you can argue that this looks a lot like a straight line. This is a sort of a slope, yeah? And let's say that slope is 0.75. Yeah? And this is 8. Okay, so what you could say is consumption is equal to 8 billion plus 0.75 times YD. And so if this is true, then what's happened is here YD has just gone through the floor. Okay, so YD has dropped from this period here to this period. Has the marginal propensity to consume changed? Very big question. We don't know. Very big question, and we don't know is the answer. So the truth about it is that wealth and consumption are related, but expected wealth and expected consumption are equally related. The idea is quite simple. If your expectation is that the price of your house will rise, okay, then it implies you might consume more. Consumption will go up. So your consumption of the price of your house at time t plus 1, say, goes up. Your consumption goes up in time t. So changes in perceived wealth change consumption. That's very, very important. So that's the second view, the Keynesian view of the household. The third view is that the household is a balance sheet. The idea that the household can be measured at a particular point in time by its assets and its liabilities. So here we have tangible capital, equities, bills, money deposits, and cash on one side, and we've got loans on this side, which you can consider, car loans, credit card loans, mortgages, that kind of stuff. And when you add up these, you get a certain amount. I don't know, let's say 100. And when you add up these, you have a certain amount, let's say 200, 210, why not? Okay, and then you get your net worth by subtracting assets from liabilities. Okay, and you get negative 110 as your net worth. Okay, and that's just the way it is. Okay, your net worth here is minus 110. Minus 110. Minus, or plus 210, sorry. And that lets the system balance. So these pictures are just benchmarks. They assume a lot in terms of rationality, information, computation, the available of goods, competitive markets. And it turns out that a lot of these things are psychologically and empirically falsified. In other words, they've been shown to be functionally untrue. They're still a pretty good guide to benchmark behavior, but at the end of the day, you should take these things with not a grain of salt, but with a barrel. Behavioral economics essentially pulls a lot of these things apart. It says, look, rationality is behaving consistently with respect to your goals. Okay, you will not find the answer to this in this course. It's a deep philosophical debate. Okay, the truth about it is people do respond to incentives, but sometimes in very strange ways. They definitely do, but sometimes in extremely strange ways, and sometimes not as the theory would predict. There's lots of very cool ideas from behavioral economics which are being explored at the moment. One is called status quo bias, tendency to make decisions by accepting the default option instead of comparing marginal benefit to marginal costs. The way to understand this is to think about applying it to pensions. Okay, the truth about it is many people don't have pensions because they're not switched on by default. Okay, that's probably true, and it's probably true of things like Windows and the QWERTY keyboard and all that. Framing, very important. How the decision is presented to affect the choice. It always affects the choice, actually. Framing is really, really important. The idea of framing shouldn't affect the outcome, but it does. Faulty discounting, people are very impatient. Remember in the lecture I talked about that marshmallow example. People are very, very impatient, and people tend to inconsistently treat the past and the future. Overconfidence. A lot of people just think they're better than they are. And one of the problems with overconfidence is that because your expectation is that you're a better, say, driver than you are, you tend to go out on the roads and drive faster, and then you cause more accidents. So another interesting one is the desire for fairness and reciprocity, and I showed the video of the monkeys and the grapes in the later lecture, all about that. Sunk costs turn out to matter. Allowing sunk costs which have already been paid to affect the decision, it really does matter, and these things do change people's behavior. Matt Rabin, a famous behavioral economist, has described rationality as the dead parrot of economics. The idea is that in some sense you're a signal processor, that price is coming in as a signal, and what you're doing actually is you're maximizing your expected utility subject to these constraints. The idea is you apply what's called an exponential discounting rule, and at the end of the day you've only got an instrumental taste for belief and information. So this is a dead parrot. It's not real, but we're treating it as if it is, as if it's still alive. The truth about it is that most of the time macroeconomics and behavioral economics simply haven't talked to one another. They haven't started talking properly yet. One of the world leaders in this field is Professor Liam Delaney at the University of Stirling. And if you click on that link, MENS 2008, you'll get a bibliography of behavioral economics, which is really interesting and well worth going through. So that brings us to the end of the second part of this lecture, where we finished describing our households, and now we're going to the first part rather, and we're going to go on to the second part and describe the firms in the next podcast. Thank you very much.